Okay. Hey, Ogre. So, we're both terribly excited about Matchup Madness, and at your suggestion, it seemed like a good idea to me. We'll hop in and talk a little bit about the format and about the roster.
Yeah.
Seems good. So let's see. This module is being run with the module that I maintain called XFS Balanced Breakfast. Steam Workshop module for Tabletop Simulator. When you enter, it'll look something like this. Let's see. Well, it says press start turn when ready, but we're not ready. We need characters, right? Here, why don't you grab a team of 3 and I'll grab a team of 3.
Sounds good.
I'm just going to pick some of my favorites, because we're not actually planning on fighting right now.
I am grabbing randomly from the backs.
Seems good.
Yeah, look at that. That's a beautiful team. Can't go wrong.
Yeah, this definitely isn't asking for blowouts in either direction. And do you know where the hidden areas are?
I do indeed. They're at the very back of the play area
Quite right.
on the lovely color-coded island.
Yep. So I'll hop back to mine. And they have instructions over there to remind folks of what to do. Now, since the teams are set, it's not as important here that you show your team to your opponent, because you can just go check and see what your opponent's team is ahead of time. Like, that's all open information. These instructions were designed for a format in which the teams aren't known ahead of time. So, basically steps 2 and 3 aren't super important. What is important is that you keep hidden which 2 characters you aren't choosing when you bring your bag back to center.
Okay, I've got my pick ready.
Well, I got mine. Hey, it's my favorite character, Emogine. Now, at this point, we would be pretty much ready to start, so we would lay things out. By the way, for those of you who aren't already familiar, this thing over here is a reference generator. If you drop a deck there, it'll do that, where it spits out a set of reference cards. You can hit 7 to draw that reference set into your hand, and then just stick it wherever you want, so you can easily refer to your opponent's options. Or if you're less familiar with all the characters, you can absolutely keep a copy of your own. Know what every character has available to them. You can use the reference cards over here if you're already familiar with them, but this is often used by folks who have TTS because, well, I mean, we can make infinite copies of everything. Why not?
If you're anything like me, it's going to be pretty vital.
Yes. So that's how you get started, right? Then you flip the coin, etc., etc. I'll leave that to folks to figure out on their own, because at that point it's just a regular game of Exceed.
Yep. And Taxicab has a really fantastic rule set document available inside of the Discord server that you can pull up if you have any questions about the exact rules of the format or how play is going to proceed throughout the set.
Yeah. Oh yeah, if you need to get your hidden areas back, like between rounds or whatever, you can hit the reset timers button and it'll make the module like it was at the start. And then start turns back off. Alright. So that's just kind of basics of that. Let's talk about the playable cast. So in theory, right, like, we could have a long video where we go into detail about what every character can do, what kind of character they are, archetype, options, what to watch out for, how to counterplay them. This is not that. We're just going to spend a few seconds covering every character so that you have the vaguest of ideas of what's going on, because the cast is pretty large at this point. There are 45 tournament legal characters.
Which is huge if you really stop and think about it. That's a very large roster of matchups to try to keep in your head.
So Akuma is explosive. His kit is made of mid-speeds, so things that are like Spike, Dive, and Assault. His ability gives both players power, so he tends to use it when he knows that he's going to be faster, go first, and crush the opponent's guard. So he's very, very punishing, but it's easy to be unsafe if the if the person he's up against is particularly fast or capable of boosting speed regularly. So keep an eye out for him boosting speed so that he can guarantee a faster attack with a ton of power.
A lot of fun to watch this guy.
Yep. Akuma games tend to end pretty explosively. A thing that I like to say about him is that he only needs to win 3 strikes. He'll just do it for about 10 damage each. Alright, here we got next. Beheaded. Ooh. Alright.
That's a good one.
Yeah, Beheaded is fancy. So, By the way, you'll notice that he has the standard card back here. If you want the printed card backs, you can go dig them out over here.
They're lovely.
But yeah, this version here has the normal set from 7th Cross, because everyone in this legal bag uses that. Actually, let's keep them laid out.
Okay.
And we'll just build as we go. The idea here is that in the middle of a tournament, if you want to look through your opponent's discards and figure out what their normals are, having the same normals for everyone makes it very easy to do that at a glance. If you want the original normals, you can always dig them out of the character, or the season-specific bag, and that's completely fine. Well, not that one, that's Red Horizon. But by default, the tournament legal bag contains 7th Cross normals for every character, so that they're easy to discern at a glance. Anyway, Beheaded. So Beheaded is, well, we can call him a ramp character. He builds up, gets stronger over time. He's kind of an all-ranger, fairly flexible, fairly mobile. His attacks are mediocre, but they get much, much stronger because over the course of the game, he levels up. Each time that he exceeds, and his exceed cost is only 2, he permanently gains some trait which modifies all of his special and ultra attacks, so not his normals. Once he has 2, he's a force to be reckoned with. Once he has 3, he's practically unstoppable. To fight him, you just gotta rush him down. To play as him, well, rush the opponent down. Land hits, exceed, level up, profit.
And I suspect you're going to be seeing a lot of him in the tournament. There's been quite a bit of discussion and a lot of interest. He's one of the newer fighters, and I think coupled with coming from a fairly popular video game, he's going to see a lot of play.
Oh yeah, Dead Cells. I need to play that. What do we got? Sea Viper. Okay, so that's another Season 3 character. Viper's also pretty explosive, actually. So her ability is that she can play boost and strike if it's a continuous boost, which means that she, when she boosts for speed, can boost for speed and then also strike immediately. So it's an extremely powerful ability that makes some of her normals remarkably high value, notably Sweep for light, Grasp for fierce, and Spike for defend. And her special boosts are no different. She can throw extra power onto things in a lot of ways. The greatest vulnerability of Viper is simply that she burns through resources like water, so she's very reliant on getting her first 3 hits so that she can use her Exceed effect to immediately draw 5 cards, reload, and keep her aggression going. Maintaining that momentum is key to good Viper play, and being able to combine the right attacks with the right boosts to guarantee hits is the other half of what makes a Viper player, well, threatening in the slightest. She's a very powerful character, but she's not easy to play.
At all. She has the benefit of being much like Akuma, though, in that when things are going right for the Viper player, it is just a blast to watch the sort of combos and the way that they execute, a winning strategy.
A blast indeed. Alright. Cammy. Okay, so Cammy is the archetypal answer character of the Street Fighter set. So she is evasive, more tricksy. She doesn't have a ton of stats to threaten. She relies on being able to outmaneuver, outposition, and just irritate her opponents to no ends with fast attacks with a lot of mobility, dodge effects, and occasionally huge explosive attacks like Gyro Drive Smasher or a well-placed Razor's Edge Slicer. But for the most part, Cammy is based around answering her opponent's threats, defusing their strongest options until she's ready to win by attrition in a longer game. Watch out for CQC. It has laid low minion opponents, and then she can win games with Gyro Drive Smasher, because if she lands that thing twice, well, you're down probably 20 plus life.
That's pretty much it.
Yep. Let's see. Carl.
Oh, man.
Alright.
I'm excited for this one.
This guy's terrifying. So, Carl is a tank. Melee bruiser. He does a lot of damage and he can take a lot of damage. His ability gives him extra armor against specials, but the part of his ability that's not on his character card is called Overload. It's a unique mechanic, exists on his ultras, that lets him create normal EX attacks more easily than others, because he can turn a normal attack into an EX attack by setting an ultra with the normal. This gives him the ability to play a lot more EXs than normal, no pun intended, then still threaten those same normals as EX attacks by maintaining the copies of his ultras that are still waiting. It's pretty terrifying. He's mix-up heavy, so if you can be a little bit tricky and bait out his threats or evade him, then you'll do okay. But he has some pretty high damage attacks and he has a decent amount of armor. So fights against Carl tend to be long and brutal, because he will absorb all of your hits, build up to 4 gauge, and then either lands Authorized Force or Exceed and become more terrifying than ever before. I'm afraid of this guy.
As well you should be. Nobody else in the entire roster throws a cup of coffee quite like this man.
That is true. Yeah, he also has a favorite matchups against my favorite characters. This guy tends to eat tanks because he has a range 1 ignore, armor, and guard attack, as many grapplers do.
I wonder how much your fear of this fighter comes from repeated training sessions into MAD.
I mean, most of it, if not all of it. Dude is scary. Alright, Celinka. Okay, so I call Celinka Rushdown. Some have disputed this definition, because Celinka will often not throw a lot of strikes, but she exerts a lot of threat very easily and very consistently. Her ability lets her just gain power bonuses every turn, essentially, if she wants to, at the cost of sealing cards out of her hands. This, over time, does mean that she will run out of options. However, if her remaining options deal enough damage, she doesn't really mind. She has terrifying openings. I've absolutely hit for, I believe, 11 damage on turn 2 with Wishing Ward.
Yeah, me, actually. I was on the other end of that.
Yes, so you can vouch. That definitely happens. So she has frightening amounts of power output. Not dissimilar to a grappler, but she doesn't quite have as many mid-speeds, so she's going to go very fast or very slow.
She's an interesting one. I think what you'll see a lot of times with her is that there's a pretty stark difference between people that are new to the fighter and people that have played her for a while. And new and old fighters in general, because that cost that's associated with her ability of sealing cards is something that newer players tend to shy away from. And so they're not really executing the kit to its fullest potential.
Yeah, Celinka's... Sorry.
No, you're good. Once they get past that, that is when things really start to come online for her. When you're willing to throw those resources away, she is terrifying.
I definitely agree. Yeah, she's at her strongest when you're using her ability not recklessly but fearlessly. Alright, Chun-li, another Season 3 fighter. So Chun-li is a zoner, actually probably the archetypal keep-away zoner, along with Sagat. She's a very different flavor than Sagat. She's a boost-oriented character who doesn't initiate strikes as often. She relies on footsies and set play to set up unbeatable attacks, but it tends to take her a bit longer. I find her pretty difficult to deal with because given enough time and enough setup, Chun-li can throw completely uncontestable attacks, and I tend to be a player that takes a decent amount of time. Stay in her face and be aggressive is the only advice I can really give. If you give her distance, she's just going to become more powerful because her Exceed mode lets her add range to all of her attacks. Range, of course, in Exceed correlates with speed, making her more potent and more contestable the farther away she gets.
Yeah, she's one that I have very little input on. I don't have a whole lot of matchup experience against her, and so she's one that, in a tournament proper, I'm really scared to run into her. She's someone that I think you need that matchup experience to do well into her, and not having it means that she's definitely going to be a blind spot.
Conversely, she can be pretty difficult to play well, together with Viper, and in my opinion, Vega. She's like one of the hardest characters in Street Fighter to perform effectively with. Jeanette. Alright, so Jeanette is... Jeanette's interesting. She starts out as a zoner and she turns into a grappler, is one way to put it. So Jeanette's normal ability, it involves placing cards from her hand, specifically specials or ultras, face down on the board to threaten various spaces, to control range, and to mess with her opponent's head. This allows her to create range-based mix-ups, force opponents to move reactively so that they can avoid whatever her next attack is that she's telegraphing, or she can use mind games to force them into moving when she wasn't actually presenting the threat that she was telegraphing. She has one of the best ultras in the game, Carmine Offering, some of the best boosts in the game, see again, the boost on Carmine Offering, and once she flips, trivial access to the most power, arguably, in the game in the shortest amount of actions. So her weaknesses are essentially that she doesn't have early game damage. Jeanette is extremely reliant on her late game to close out, so throw in as much damage as you can before she flips, and you'll probably be okay. Once she exceeds, though, she'll be throwing a ton of power at you every turn. Any comments on Jeanette?
Only that I had a very very mistaken interpretation of how she was to be played before becoming a more active part of the Discord community, and actually having you yourself play her into me a number of times. She's one that I think is tricky because some parts of her kit tell you to do one thing, and really where she gets scary is when you start doing the other thing, and that's like you mentioned, getting to that exceed mode as quickly as you can and just leveraging it to terrorize the other guy.
Yep. She is as a 7th cross character. She shares the general archetype of becoming more powerful the more transformations she has, and then exceeding to close games decisively.
Decisively is a good word for it.
All right, Dan. Dan's the man. Dan is great. He is Season 3's Wild Swing character. His ability gives him stats whenever he's wild swinging if he spins gauge to critical. This makes him sound like a high-risk, high-reward character, and it is perfectly possible to play him that way, to be highly aggressive, to use his ability to critical wild swing a lot. However, he also has a bunch of tools that allow him to stack his deck and manipulate his hand shape in various ways to get maximum value out of his ultras, which are free if he doesn't have any cards in hand, barring Legendary Taunt, which is a whole shenanigan in its own right. So Dan is a decently complex character who can nonetheless be played in a very straightforward way, or he can be maximized in a more patient play style, which is one of my favorite things about him. Dan is about emptying your hands, trusting the odds, and letting the deck carry you, or stacking the deck and making sure that the odds are always in your favor.
This is a guy for me that when I think about Dan, and like the really my favorite thing about him as a fighter is that he's someone that's about moments, right? There's a whole bunch of discussion that we could have about power level and relative execution for a lot of these guys, but with Dan, what sticks in my mind are the stories that he creates in matchups that involve him. Some of the funniest exceed moments that I have in my memory come from this guy, and some of the crazy things that his card shapes make you do, and just all of his flavor. It's really great.
Emogine! That's my girl. Alright, well, this is my favorite character, and I make no secret about it. So, Emogine is a bloodthirsty brawler. She's actually a heavyweight. It's a close-range tank. Her favorite range is 2, but she functions pretty well at range 1 because of the preponderance of sweep shapes in her kits. What Emogine wants to do is counterattack. She's going to let her opponent strike into her when at all possible, and then use her ability to build gauge or filter out bad options when she's responding with her wild swings. She is a wild swing character. I probably should have mentioned that first. But, you know, I play everyone like a wild swing character, so who am I to say? Like every 7th cross character, she values her transformations. She values blood for blood the highest in her kit. And she has a decent amount of shenanigans related to her ultras, which I'll let you figure out on your own. Suffice to say, if you're playing Emogine, stick to range 2, wild swing on defense. If you're fighting against Emogine, try to let her initiate and boost war with her, because her boosts aren't very good. Outstat her, and by all means, don't stand at range 2.
Yeah, bad plan. She's another one that's a lot of fun to watch happen, though. Enchantress.
So this is the Keep Away Zoner from Season 4. Enchantress is a resource-intensive Keep Away Zoner whose ability essentially allows her to reload her hand whenever it's empty, or in Exceed mode, she just always has a full hand practically whenever she wants. She has a lot of tricky ranged attacks, but her damage is fairly poor until she's in late game and stocking up to unleash her very powerful ultras. Stay in her face or very close to her, and threaten her with decent damage. If you can outtrade her instead of allowing her to outmaneuver you, you'll do okay. And if you're Enchantress, play the resource game and use your boosts to run your opponent out of options while you set up your late game.
She's one from Season 4 that you quite enjoyed, if I recall correctly, right?
One of my favorites.
I've played many matches into her in playtesting.
Yep, I'll mention the other 2 favorites as I get to them. Eugenia. Not one of the most popular characters of Season 2 for people to fight against, decently popular for people to play as. Eugenia's shtick is that she has a lot of effects which cause her to discard cards in the opponent's hands, winnowing down their options to remove their answers to her more potent threats, or rendering them unable to answer attacks such as Cat's Cradle, or, Color Spray. Attacks that work best when the opponent's hand is practically empty. She leans into hand knowledge and resource management, and has a decent array of options to support that. but she also can just be a grappler and slam you in the face for 1,000,000 damage with Queen of Hearts. The trick with Eugenia is essentially that she leans into her range tools to force you to stay close to combat her other threats, but if you can maintain your resources and stick pretty close to her, you'll outtrade her in the early game, and then you can evade her in the late game. That's my opinion anyway.
I don't really have a solid opinion on this one yet. She's very strange. I feel like she plays the game much differently than most of the rest of the cast. And actually, I have a friend who recently started picking Exceed up, and this is a character that he's sort of gravitating to. And that's one of the first comments he made, was that he likes to play her because she feels like she's playing a slightly different game within the same arena. And I think that might be one of the best descriptions of her that I've heard.
Quite true. Characters in Exceed can often be played as quote-unquote fighting game characters or quote-unquote card game characters, because Exceed is both. And different characters play into different parts of the core engine in different ways. Eugenia and Enchantress are great examples of card game characters. Carl and Celinka are much more fighting game characters. Practically the whole set of Street Fighter is about fighting game characters, with the possible exception of Scott.
Seems appropriate.
Whereas there are more card gaming mechanics in Season 2. Fights. Together with Beheaded, Fight is a Season 4 promo, or solo fighter, actually. Don't be misled when I say promo, he's still perfectly tournament legal. That's why he's in the back. Just like with Beheaded, by default, he'll be using the same card backs as everyone else with the 7th Cross normals. Feel free to fish out the original Fight if you like his original card backs. Wait, where is he?
They're very good.
Oh, I have him over here. What? There we go. Looks pretty cool. The drawback for players who don't know, there is a typo on one of Fight's normals. I just have to disclose that now, so if you grab his original costume, please, please, please be aware. Focus has 5 guard, not 4. It's important. Alright. What is Fight's shtick? Oh, right. Throwing 1,000,000 power at you all the time. So, much like Akuma, he can throw a ton of power on any of his attacks as long as he's willing to risk that they'll miss, be outsped, or if he's willing to set them up so that he can confirm the hit and guarantee it. The difference between him and Akuma is that he doesn't fail explosively, but he will burn out of resources. Fight relies on careful resource management to ensure that he always has enough force available to throw more damage at his opponent, and he needs to time his Exceed carefully to get the most value out of it.
Yeah, he's another in I think a long chain of fighters that follow that sort of mold. I spend my resources to gain, large amounts of power, and in his case, rather than in Celinka's, from what I've seen in any way, newer fighters seem to be more, or newer players rather, seem to be more willing to spend force than to seal cards. And I'm not sure if that's because they know they're going to get them back after the reshuffle or not, but very recently we got a chance to watch some tournament footage from the taxi meta, and I saw some players using Fight to really good effect, and just burning cards left and right to blow the opponent up. It was a lot of fun.
I should also mention, Fight is essentially a ranged character. He has some melee options, and of course, he can use the normals, so don't underestimate him in close range. But the strongest parts of his kit work best when he is at range 3 or greater. Galdred.
Hey.
Galdred's pretty hype. So Galdred is another interesting card gamey character. His thing is that he doesn't handle resources like anyone else on the planet. Instead of drawing it in turn, he resets his hand to 3, whether he has more or less. So if he empties his hand completely, he reloads to 3. If he goes up to 4, well, now he has to discard. Galdred is about collecting the pieces of Exodia, so-called, getting all 5 of his transformations in play and then exceeding. You will need to have good neutral play on front side in order to win effectively with Galdred. But if you can do that, then getting the 5 pieces becomes easier, because your opponent will learn to overestimate and underestimate the wrong threats at the wrong times. If you always play the most obvious thing, then you can get blown out. But present the mix-up threat, make the opponent respect you, and then throw Violent Transgression in their face, and get one of the best transformations in the game. Notably, he also has fantastic Ultra Boosts, so if he starts with the Hydra Helix in his hand, you're having a bad day.
Let's take bets, D. How many Galdreds do you think we're going to see in Matchup Madness?
Overall? Oh, I mean, at least 3, I'm sure.
3?
I think so. I can think of 2 players I know who really like Galdred, and I fully expect that there will be some newer players who want to take him for a spin.
I'll set my number at 1,
Ah.
and then later on we can come back and see.
I'm gonna laugh if it's 2 and we're both wrong. Yeah, Galdred has an interesting reputation because those who have competed at Gen Con know he is to be feared. There's a skilled player who's appeared at multiple Gen Cons, which is our main real-life tournament, or in-person tournament, I guess I should say, and has took second 2 years ago. I don't remember his placement this last year, but I believe he tied for second as well. However, on the Discord or in the Taxi meta, he has a reputation as being somewhat underwhelming, because he can't go through his deck as quickly as other characters, meaning it is more difficult for him to collect those pieces. The trade-off is that if he does, he becomes an incredibly deadly threat. Excuse me. By the way, his favorite range is 2. Galdred. Wait, hold on. Geoffrey. Or Geoffrey, I don't know. Yeah, this guy. He's one of the more annoying characters to fight against, specifically because he has a transformation which allows him to turn off opponent boosts. If you are a boost-based character, watch out for this card. It will ruin your day. Try to parry it, or just, well, never get hit by it. Once that's in play, he can spend force to prevent you from being able to boost. Geoffrey, in general, is a tanky heavyweight, and he's kind of a zoner anti-zoner. So he has ranged options, but he's not able to present them forever, but he uses them to discourage you from fighting him at range, because he can throw big chunky damage at you. Then when you come in close, he uses his close range tools to outbrawl you. He is, in general, a very potent character who has mix-up threats in every situation. His ultras are fantastic examples of this. Crusader's Oath lets him dodge faster attacks, and Inviolable Judgment lets him trade with the world. Any comments on Geoffrey? Or Geoffrey?
Yeah, sorry, I had to mute Mike. My dogs are a little bit upset about whatever's going on outside. This guy is one that I think everybody that is maybe newer to Exceed needs to keep a close eye on this tournament. I've seen a bunch of people training with him in the general rooms, and when he gets to do what he wants to do, he controls the shape of the game in a way that it's really something to watch it, and he does it in a way that's slightly different than most other fighters. The ability to shut down boosts, as D touched on, is insane. That's, boost play is such a big part of playing Exceed in general, that somebody that can tell you no when it comes to interacting with that set of your resources, just by default, is going to lead to some really crazy game states.
Mm-hmm. If you're having trouble handling Geoffrey, or Geoffrey, I honestly don't know. Initiate with Spike, initiate with Dive, initiate with Cross. Force him to learn that he has to respond with Assault in order to beat Spike and Dive, and once he does that, represent the mix-up threat. Initiate with Focus, initiate with Sweep, initiate with Cross. Or an Assault of your own, if you're feeling lucky. You can also rely on boosts to give yourself a stat edge, which is why he actually needs that transformation. If he isn't able to get it, then you can outboost for him if you have a decent array of boosts in your kit, because in general, he doesn't. Like most of the cross characters, his set play and his neutral are impacted by the fact that he only has transformations on a number of his cards instead of boosts. Use that to your advantage. Okay, this guy goes with everything, so I hear. So, Guile. Guile's a fascinating beast because he, something went a little bit wrong in his development after release. So he's supposed to be a defensive character who doesn't get much benefit from initiating strikes, who expects to play very reactively. He has a bunch of boosts that play into this. They are kind of the down back of Exceed, where he puts a boost into play, and then at the end of his next turn he'll go to gauge. So he can either strike with the benefit, or just keep down backing and build up resources, preparing for a stronger attack later on. That said, an important rule of Exceed is that you don't check hand size after a strike. So if during a strike you draw until you have more cards than 7, it's fine, no one cares. You only check hand size after you draw at the end of your turn. Guile's Exceed mode allows him to draw a bunch of cards with the change cards action, and then strike, meaning he can overdraw, strike, and then do it again next turn, building a larger and larger hand as he goes. This is affectionately known as Big Hand Guile, And honestly, you need to respect it, because what the key thing it does is it allows him to collect EX attacks and build up for finishing moves like Preemptive Strike, Critical EX Spinning Back Knuckle, which is a Speed 7, Power 8 attack at range 1 and 2.
Which is terrifying.
Absolutely. Be ready to block his payouts or parry Sonic Hurricane, so he can't play Preemptive Strike. The other major Guile line is not to do Big Hand Guile, but instead to hang on to that gauge for his devastating Ultra attacks. Like most Street Fighter characters, he leans into mid-speeds for a lot of his power budget, which means if you can play faster attacks and be more evasive, you'll generally be able to make it out alright. But watch out for the EX mode of Big Hand Guile, so to speak. Oh, and by the way, if he does do that, consider playing Reading. It's hard for him to spin a turn. Yes. It's hard for him to spin a turn doing anything but striking once he's gone over hand size, because it feels really bad to end your turn and discard a bunch of cards. So he's going to usually end up stuck with a bunch of normals in hand that he can't get rid of.
And that's advice that can be followed for any fighter that sort of fits into that mold of playing with a really large hand. As they go through more and more of their deck and the odds of normals, get higher and higher inside of their hand, and as their hand gets larger, saving those focuses to play as readings can really secure you the hits that you need to close it out, end the game before they can leverage that advantage against you.
Mm-hmm. Having a bunch of cards in hand is great, but it does not automatically mean that you're likely to win strikes. Iaquis, I think, is how they have told me it's pronounced now.
I thought his name was Fight Me.
True enough. So, this chap is fantastic fun. I like him a lot. Despite appearances, or should I say because of appearances, you can see that he's wielding multiple swords, a spear, an axe, probably some other melee weapons. Naturally, this is a ranged character, who is at his strongest when he's allowed to engage with unanswerable threats at long range. So he has some decent fireball shapes, Dragon Spine, which is the aerial fireball shape of Go Hidoken, but it's slow and guardy. Dragon's Flight, which, despite appearances, is a range 2 to 5 attack because of its advanced 3 effect. Works best at range 4 and 5. And then Dragon's Fire, which is a fairly subpar high fireball, range 2 to 5, but, it's probably 5 power. If you're wondering why these do so much damage, his ability lets him gain +2 power if he strikes face up. This means in the hands of an experienced player, he is extremely dangerous because he can often play unanswerable threats and just get an extra free +2 power on top of them. He also has a boost that gives him +4 speed, and if you let that thing sit and play for a turn, well, now he has +4 speed and +2 power, because he's just going to use it to make whatever he has guaranteed, and get free power on top. I would say save your techs for this boost. The risk of that is that Iaquis is known to like to play Reading Dive if he thinks you're holding on to a tech. And then he'll play something even more punishing, like a face-up assault. In general, this dude is very scary. Stay fairly close to him, save your grasps and your crosses, and sometimes your dives, and use block and focus wisely. Any thoughts on Iaquis?
No, Fight Me.
Cool. Oh, I should mention he does have an Exceed mode. By the time he's ready to Exceed, the opponent's often just dead, but it allows him to fuse attacks together. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Plague Knight. Ken, aka Spicy Ryu. Have you not heard that one?
I have not heard that one.
Yeah, that's what we call them at conventions. Do you want Ryu or Spicy Ryu?
Like it.
Alright, so Ken is the archetypal all-range rushdown character out of Street Fighter. So we've actually got more than one rushdown, more than one all-range. He's the one who combines them both. Ken can fight at every range. He has a very powerful fireball, stronger if he crits. If you're not familiar with crit, it's the mechanic in Street Fighter that lets you spin a gauge to gain extra effects on your attack. Anyway, very powerful range fireball, and he has multiple spike-shaped moves, meaning moves that beat focus and sweep at close range. He has to boost war or play his now strike boosts to make them guaranteed in many cases, but he can do that, and that's terrifying. Once he builds 4 gauge, he presents the massive stat threat of Shinryuken or EX Shinryuken, or Swift Attack Shinryuken, or True Mastery Shinryuken, or anything Shinryuken. Basically, if you get hit by Shinryuken, your day is ruined. I'm sorry. Much like with Ryu, as you'll hear later, he has an extremely good Ultra Boost that you'll often want to save your tech for, but just like with Iaquis, be careful. Reading Dive is a thing. Let's see. In general, what do you do with Ken? Stay out of range 2. Range 2 is his favorite range. If you're a Ken player, don't always use your character ability to close and draw. Sometimes you just want to stand still and prep, force your opponent to come to you. Remember that Ken actually does have range threats that he can present. Anything about Ken?
he's another that I am still learning about. Thankfully, Blue, who is another member of the community, is very happy to show anyone just how dangerous Ken is.
No doubt. King Knight.
Hey, D!
One of my worst characters.
This is your favorite from Season 4, right? That's what I heard.
Right, sure. So King Knight, I don't dislike him. I'm just terrible with him. Let's see if I get this right, though. I can tell you what he does. King Knight's ability is that he has these things called decrees. They're cards that have boosts on them that live kind of outside the game that he can put into play by taking the boost action. That's his character ability. Once he exceeds, he gets access to 2 more, which are even fancier, the Magnificent Cape and the Pay-to-Win decree. But basically, he throws stats at you all day. Whenever he resolves a continuous boost or decree, he draws an extra card. So he just piles on the stats, and then I'm guessing he does something to win with them. I personally am kind of bad at that part. Any thoughts on King Knight?
Despite, maybe because of Dee's inability to play this guy, I got to spend a pretty good chunk of time with him in playtesting. And he's just a lot of fun. He's another one that, like Dan, when I think about King Knight, I think, number 1, Assault Man. Lots of Assault in his kit. And number 2, he's got fun moments, you know? Playing the Magnificent Cape, Glorious Decree. That's something cool. It's like putting on the shades with Guile. Whether or not it does what you want it to do, it's fun to do it. And that's kind of what I take away from him.
Take note, by the way, unlike the other characters that have very threatening boosts, you can't tech decrees. Once they're in play, they're just in play. So save your blocks. Don't try to parry things with him most of the time. Just be ready to absorb a lot of damage. By the way, when he said he has a bunch of assaults, that's because he has a bunch of moves that close him in. So he doesn't necessarily favor range 1. I think his favorite range is actually 2, but he will very often connect with attacks at range 1. Oh, right. And King of Cards is a hilarious attack and extremely powerful. Be wary. Luciya! One of the most enjoyable characters in 7th Cross, in my humble opinion. Luciya is extremely mobile. She is a swift, agile, light-hitting speedster. Her ability deals damage and builds gauge whenever she crosses over the opponent, so expect her to be zipping back and forth a decent amount. But her greatest threat is actually in being able to present mix-up threats and in having answers to everything. Luciya, when played as an answer character, can find a way out of basically every situation because she has access to Ride the Lightning, which is a very cheap ultra attack at speed 8 that can get her out of melee or just deal damage to anything speed sensitive, meaning something that doesn't have armor or guard on it, at practically any range. She also has Skies of Flame, which is a speed 5 attack that tends to be above curve when she plays it and lets her move to any space afterwards. So again, hit for a decent amount of damage, dodge everything. When she's looking to close the game, she can exceed to turn all of her built-up gauge into power bonuses as she spends them on things, making her pretty good at closing games due to the amount of speed on her attacks. Comments on this here?
This might be a good time to discuss, actually. You've mentioned a couple of times the differences between an answer character and a question character. Just loosely, how do you define each of those two?
Well, it's very much... So I refer to them generally as how the character functions most of the time, like the majority of the time. But what a question character is the character who is presenting the threats. Somebody who will quote-unquote win by default if the opponent doesn't find a way to deal with them. So Iaquis is always a question character, or almost always a question character, because he slams something on the table face up and says, "Fight me." He throws +2 power, whatever, at you, and it's your job to find a way out. He's asking a question. You better come up with an answer, or he'll maul you. Cammy and Luciya can often be played as answer characters, meaning they sit back with options like CQC at range 1, Ride the Lightning at any range, Downburst at range 2 or 3, Skies of Flame at range 3 or 4, and go, you know, you can attack me if you want to, but you're not going to hit me. Like, there's nothing you can do that'll hit me if I decide you're not going to hit me. So these are characters that have the ability to be safe a lot of the time, but often don't threaten much payout. Cammy's greatest power budget is on Gyro Drive Smasher, with some in her Exceed mode and a bit on Spiral Arrow as well. Luciya, if she wants to do damage, tends to need to Exceed. So her Exceed turns her from an answer character into a question character, but it doesn't remove the question capabilities of her attacks. It just makes her less efficient at building resources to spend.
That's an interesting facet of Season 2 characters, actually, is that the way that the Exceeds function here versus in some other seasons, it's not always a straight power jump. Sometimes it's a change in playstyle, or sometimes it's a radical change in playstyle, entirely changing the way that their cards interact with the rest of their kit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as you mentioned, that's something that's interesting here, is that she goes from one archetype answer to another question.
Yes. In Season 2, it's common to flip from question to answer to question when you exceed, and it's a decision you have to make each game. Emogine switches from being an answer character to being a question character. Jeanette switches from being an answer character to being a question character. Iaquis switches from one question to a different question, and Galdred just starts asking questions once he exceeds. Meanwhile, we're not playing with Season 1, so actually I should probably move this over a bit in the tournament. But in Seasons 3 and 4, most of the time, when you exceed, you just go from whatever you're doing in the first place to asking much louder questions.
Indeed. Would you feel comfortable saying that another way to phrase that difference would be the difference between proactive and reactive characters?
Yeah, that's reasonable. It's not the difference between active and passive play, to be clear, because an answer character will often still have to actively work in order to make sure their answers are viable. But a character who wants to react to what their opponent's doing is an answer character. A character who wants to impose something that their opponent must react to is going to be a question character.
Perfect.
Bison! Bison's a hoot. This guy is kind of the gauge character, the gauge monster of SF. He builds gauge at will, tons of it, as much as he wants, really. And then he throws it at practically everything. He wants to crit all of his attacks, even normals, just to present mix-up threat. He has a bunch of stats, and he just throws stats at you for days. His favorite range is 3. He's also pretty decent at range 1, however, because he has a very powerful Ultra, and an attack that ignores armor, so that he can present that mix-up threat if you think that you're safe playing block. You're not safe playing block, as a rule. He has some fantastic boosts, and generally makes a lot out of every resource handed to him. This might all sound pretty overwhelming. That's kind of the idea. Bison, like Enchantress, is a boss character, someone who doesn't interact with resources in the normal ways that characters interact with resources. He just has resources all the time, for free. What he lacks is, we'll call it tempo, but what I'm referring to is action economy, essentially. It takes Bison a long time to do things. He needs to take a turn to build a gauge, or maybe he can build 3 gauge with it. That's nice too, but then he's throwing away a card that's decently valuable. If he wants to play one of his awesome boosts, well, it costs probably a force and a turn, and then it's your turn, and you can do stuff of your own. So he asks questions, but he asks them pretty slowly.
I'm really curious to see what his performance in Matchup Madness winds up looking like. He's got kind of a storied past in that I think there's been a lot of dissension about where exactly he clocks in terms of relative power rating. There have been thoughts all over the board. You know, he's best from the season. He's not that great. I think in general, it's pretty accepted that in the hands of a good player, he's in the upper echelon, right? Like, he's not somebody that is being considered weak by any means.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think Taxi and I are in agreement that he's probably about average in strength overall. I do think he's pretty terrible if you just play him in the most obvious way, which is to say that you play normals without critical, and you play his specials critical, and you build 4 gauge, and then you play a critical ultra, because this means that basically everything you're doing is face up or almost face up. And I do not value characters who are that predictable. A predictable Bison can get taken apart. But if you play mix-ups, if you play your specials without critical, or you play your normals with critical, or you build 4 gauge, then you play spike, right? Like, critical spike is an underrated attack, but it's one of the best attacks Bison can play, because the opponent thinks it's something else, specifically head stomp, or nightmare booster, or whatever it is. So I think if you play him like a filthy liar, then he's very strong. But if you play honest Bison, then he's pretty underwhelming.
And take notes.
Ooh, Minato. Alright.
If I could pause real quick.
Sure.
This is probably a good time to say, I think we should all take a minute and thank Taxi for organizing and really bringing together what is turning out to be an incredibly epic event in Exceed history. This thing's huge,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't be if it wasn't for Taxi taking the time to get people invested and get people fired up about it. So thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Quite agree. Well done, Taxi. If y'all are wondering why, like, we're talking about Taxi right now, Taxi mains Minato. There's a card called Cab Stands in his kit, and Taxi's screen name is Taxi Cab. And he's also one of the better Minato players, maybe the best Minato player in the Taxi meta. In Discord, we have Mad Fenora representing. So, what is Minato? Minato is a highly mobile, maybe the most mobile in the game, character who is an all-ranger, but prefers to be at longer range, controlling ranges 3 and 4 in particular. But he's a technical character with a wide variety of win cons, which is short for win condition. There's a lot of things he can do to win. Generally, he wants to turn into a stat monster using the transformation on bus stop, and then outstat you all the time. You will need to stay close to his face to beat him, and defend on curve, so that he doesn't manage to escape with barnstorming or cross, and get to a range where he can play Flight 13 or just start milling you. Milling is a term from Magic, which involves discarding cards from the opponent's deck. He has a boost which lets him do this, which also enables his game plan, so he's encouraged to play it. He can accelerate his own game plan of returning cards from a sealed area to his hand, while also drawing you closer to decking out, buying him time. This is a very threatening line of play, so make sure you're aware of it and prepared to deal with it.
So he's one from the card game.
Oh yes.
Fighters that you mentioned earlier on.
Oh yes, Minato is almost entirely a card game. In fact, he probably plays a few card games himself, while the opponent's trying to play Exceed.
Seems reasonable.
That's debatable. Mole Knight. So Mole Knight from season 4.
Somewhere in Australia.
Yes, yes.
Turned his head.
Yes, the joke about Mole Knight, courtesy of Reggie, Reggie's Born Everything, one of our Australian players in the Discord meta, is that he must be Australian because he's from down under. Yeah.
Oh god.
Anyway, Mole Knight is a stats monster and a heavyweight, who uses his burrow to ensure that he's never out of range. So he basically places this thing on the board, moves it around, makes sure, and then sometimes he can choose to, when he initiates a strike, declare that he's going to move to the burrow as a before effect. This means it's practically impossible to zone him. You need to essentially just call all of his mix-ups correctly, or call enough of his mix-ups correctly to outtrade him most of the time, or evade his strongest hits. Be wary of Caven, which is a very potent mix-up card. It's a 2-gauge ultra that beats anything with movement and loses to everything else. And Erupt, which is a 3-gauge ultra that just does 1,000,000 damage. Rounding. Mole Knight...
Strong rounding.
Mole Knight likes to build 4-gauge and then Exceed, because his Exceed mode is basically a Red Horizon Exceed. It just says, hey, whenever you use your burrow, you have +2 power. If you actually move. If you don't move because one of the players is occupying the burrow, well, it doesn't do any good. That is, by the way, one of the ways to deal with Mole Knight. Doesn't always work, but if you can stand on the burrow for long enough, it essentially turns off his character ability and forces him to play honest. He's not nearly as strong when he's not able to use it for mix-ups.
I'd like to point out that one thing about Mole Knight that actually recently caught me off guard. You need to be aware of dive usage with Mole Knight. He's one of the fighters in the roster that can dive you from really interesting ranges. Because of the way that Burrow interacts with his attack shapes, there's many more positions that he can use to dive you than most fighters.
Yep.
And we're sort of trained to know, okay, when I am at this range, I can be dove, and so we play around it. Mole doesn't care about that. Mole can dive you from any number of places.
Yep, keep an eye on the burrow. Alright, next up we have one of my favorite characters from Season 4, Plague Knight. This guy's a big ball of shenanigans, wrapped up in a potion, stuck in a bottle, and left to explode. So his thing is, and I mentioned that I would talk about Iaquis' Exceed ability, because it's very, very similar to this. Iaquis can combine 2 cards together, adding... Basically, he discards a card when he sets his attack. This is Exceed Iaquis, mind you. And if he does, he adds before hit and after triggers printed on the attack portion of that card, not the boost, to whatever his attack is. So he kind of fuses 2 things together. Plague Knight can do the same thing, although when he does his discard, he does it at random, meaning he doesn't have complete control unless his hand is very small. This forces him to maintain a pretty aggressive playstyle so that he doesn't have too many cards in hand so that his ability can be more consistent. Plague Knight plays a decent amount of card game. He relies a lot on hand management, resource management, messing with the shape of his hand, making his ability more consistent, and then fusing attacks for maximum value. In return, however, he doesn't have a lot of damage. Most of his power budget is in his ability and his flexibility, and on his ultras.
One of the things that we talk about a lot in Exceed is spectacle, and I think that word should be printed just on this guy's card somewhere. That's everything that he's about. There's something exciting about watching a game where the things that Plague can do unfold, and you watch, hit effects be duplicated or triplicated, and all the things that happen in that fight makes for just a really entertaining match in general.
I love Plague. He's good times. Great shenanigans. The way to deal with Plague is essentially tank through most of his hits. He relies on his ability to fuse movement with attacks to dominate at range. Once he's in close range, he's much less powerful, and he's just trying to gain value out of trading hits, whereas he doesn't have much printed power in his attacks, as I described. So he leans into throwing a bunch of extra power on things, but he spends a lot of cards to do it. So if you can tank through his hits, you'll actually probably be okay, but you need to stay in his face to do it. If you let him get to range, then his options dramatically expand. Polar Knight.
Hey!
I hear somebody might like this guy, which is fair. He's really cool, so to speak. Polar Knight throws icicle. Yes. Yes. I have no shame.
That hurt.
I know. So, he basically digs up ice spikes across the arena and then tries to slam his opponent onto them to get extra power off of his character ability. He normally can only place them in unoccupied spaces, though he has a few cards which are exceptions to this. And they start out at +2 power and they turn into +3 after he exceeds. Polar Knight is, he's interesting. He's a tanky heavyweight, and he's a fairly honest character. So he tends to play slow defensive things and just plow into the opponent's face, throw them onto an ice spike, deal a ton of damage. You'll need to play evasively and carefully, and try to not let him land hits most of the time. If he does, though, you can often answer him with focus, which has opponents cannot move you. But be wary of, where is it? Doesn't he yeah, there you go. Ignore armor. So if you're already standing on a spike, well, unfortunately, he can break through a focus once he's in Exceed mode by dealing extra +3 damage on this thing. He also has a very, very fast DP. That's short for Dragon Punch. It refers to a type of attack in fighting games. In Exceed, a DP is shaped like an above-curve attack, specifically at range 2. So this is Stomp. Speed 7, range 2, hit push 2. It's an extremely safe, very valuable defensive move. If he uses it on offense, he can often use it to gain advantage, and also some positioning, which will let him follow up with one of his range 3 or 4 moves. Polar Plow, Shovel Drop, Shovel Charge, or Icicle Drop. Oh, also, uniquely, he has the Text of Block on an Ultra. It's the only place that's appeared anywhere in the game, as far as I can recall.
It's a fun Ultra. This is a fighter that I have spent a lot of time with. He's one of my favorites. He's someone that I'll be repping in the tournament myself, actually. And if I could say one thing to newer players, maybe trying to pick him up, it's to be mindful of your ice field. As you're seeding the board, think about not necessarily where the opponent is, but where they want to be. Sometimes placing an ice spike 3 spaces behind the opponent instead of under them means that now they have to think whenever you throw an attack before they play that cross, because maybe you played something that's going to take advantage of them moving onto that ice spike, or maybe you're going to capitalize on them moving the turn after. So a little bit of forward thinking, even though Polar Knight is, as Dee mentioned, a very honest fighter, if you kind of plan ahead and you place those spikes strategically, you can really, I think, surprise people with how much you can do, how quickly, when they step into the zone. And then, as part of that, whenever you get to the latter half of the game with him, using the boost on Icicle Drop to remove ice spikes from the field, fill your hand back up, and getting ready to move your ice field to account for, just changing game state is a huge part of playing him well.
Thank you, Ogre. Alright, Pooky! Pooky is a psychotic little rabbit, who is very aggressive, leans into playing a bunch of boosts in a row once he's set up to do it. Pooky shines in the mid-game, where he meets the criterion for a bunch of his boosts that say, now, if something, take another action. So he piles on a bunch of stats, and then unleashes something like Long on the Tooth, or Drunken Rampage, or just Pooky Drinks, to keep all of his boosts in play, gain extra resources, gain extra life, and prepare for an even bigger attack on the next turn. Careful use of Pooky Drinks and Gambling I'm In is essential to good Pooky play. Without gambling, he's too reliant on making use of his specials, because his character ability only applies to specials and ultras by default. And without drinks, all of his attacks, all of his boosts can be wasted by an opponent who is careful and evasive, or just blocks at the right time. He's a fast rabbit. Probably favors range 3 in my opinion.
I haven't seen a whole lot of Pooky. I'm hoping that we get some players repping him in the tournament, just so that I have an opportunity to go and look at some of that footage and maybe catch the matches in person, just because I want to see what he does. I know it's Juppies, right? Juppies is someone that
Juppies likes Pooky quite a lot. Yep, I don't know if he's bringing him or not. I know that Juppies likes his Exceed a lot better than I do, so I value speed very highly. His normal ability gives him speed. His Exceed ability gives him power and armor, as well as card draw. These fix a number of issues that he has with not having consistent card flow and just not having enough power output to close games. But, well, I'm addicted to plus speed, so I prefer his frontside ability. Note that he has transformations on his ultra attacks, which helps to enable his Exceed ability in particular, so you're going to want to have a transformation in play before you flip. Ideally, you will Exceed with one transformation in play, one card engage, and, let's see, 3 or fewer cards in hands. Huh. Looks like Ogre DC'd from the TTS server. Alright, well, I'll keep going.